This is the 1941 CKD number 1930 locomotive at the Hesston Steam Museum. I'm Darren, and this is the Industrial Revolution.
This 2-foot gauge, model BS70 040T locomotive was built by Českomoravská kolbin Dansk, which is really hard to pronounce. So fortunately, it's usually called CKD, or sometimes called CSK for some reason. 040T means 0 lead or pilot wheels, 4 drivers, 0 trailing wheels, and the T means it's a tank engine, so there's no tender. Of course, that's the white designation, which is used in North America, but being built in Europe, it also has the European designation of B600/70. That's B for 2 driving axles, so 4 drivers, 600 millimeter gauge, which is 2 feet, and 70 horsepower. This coal-fired locomotive runs with a max 170 psi operating pressure and these seemingly tiny little 24-inch drivers, which are actually smaller than the wheels on modern rail cars. Being built in Europe, of course, there's a couple other very visible differences if you're used to looking at North American steam locomotives. First, there's the round windows. There's a lot of theories about why European windows are round and North American ones are rectangular. But one that was proposed is that it's because North American cabs were usually built of wood, where it's easiest to install rectangular windows, while European locomotives were more often made of steel, where it's easier to cut round holes for the windows, and then you could actually install ship portholes, as those were readily available. There's a number of other theories out there, though, and it's probably a combination of things. Put your favorite theory down in the comments. The second big visual difference is the buffers. These are traditionally 2 circular plates, but being a pretty narrow locomotive, the plates here actually ended up being merged into a single plate with a slot cut through the center for the link that's used to couple the rest of the train. So this locomotive was built in 1940 in Czechoslovakia for Germany, which had actually invaded the country a year earlier. It was part of an order of at least 200 various locomotives, 50 of which were this model. At 2-foot gauge, this is very much a narrow gauge locomotive, and you might wonder why anyone would build that narrow. Well, 2-foot gauge locomotives are actually really useful in a lot of cases. They're great in mines where space is especially limited, or in industrial and factory settings where you just don't need the power and expense of a larger locomotive. They were also good for logging railroads, and a surprisingly large number of amusement parks also run 2-foot gauge trains. The Germans, though, actually ordered it for yet another reason. They ordered this 2-foot gauge locomotive to help build the Autobahn east into Russia. 2-foot gauge locomotives were great for the job. These construction railroads were built temporarily along the route in order to move people, equipment, and materials to and around the construction site. Being small and light, they could be built with light rails, less rail bed work, and the bridges and trestles were smaller, so they were faster and cheaper to build too. And build they did. Building the national Autobahn system, mostly in the 1930s, created Germany's national highway system, and everyone got into the act, at least in front of the cameras. Most of the Autobahn was already done by the time this locomotive was built, and further construction was actually halted in 1941 due to the war. So this is where a bit of mystery actually pops up in number 1930's history. There's 2 versions of the story from here. The first version, and the version that's supported here at the Hesston Steam Museum, is that of the 50 locomotives of this model that were ordered, all of them were built, but only 49 were actually delivered. This one was actually hidden by anti-German Czechs. They stashed it under a giant pile of straw. Today that sounds odd, Straw piles were actually really common at the time before straw was routinely baled. Anyway, under the pile of straw, it was then forgotten about for a few decades. I really liked this story, and I have to admit I was a bit disappointed while researching this locomotive to find a different version. In the second version, which I'm recounting here because I try to give all available information on this channel, the locomotive actually was delivered. Since it was designated to be used on Autobahn construction east into Russia, and since Russia hadn't actually been overtaken yet, this locomotive was temporarily parked until Germany won the war there. Since they never defeated Russia, they simply never used it. So which version is true? Well, if you have information or ideas, please post those down in the comments. But here's what we do know. The locomotive was definitely never put into regular use. When it arrived here at Hesston, it still had chalk marks on the boiler from its original construction, and really no wear on the cylinders or anything. It was probably test fired, and it may have made one trip, either to get under a stack of straw or to a switchyard somewhere where it was parked, but it definitely didn't do much more than that. In favor of the hidden story, would a country at war have this locomotive sitting around in a yard and never actually put it to use? In favor of the parked and forgotten story, though, Germans were pretty well known for being very orderly and meticulous. So would they really have not noticed if a steam locomotive wasn't delivered? Also, being a 2-foot gauge, it's not like they could have put this locomotive out on their main line and put it to use anyway, since they ran 4-foot 8.5 inch or 1435 millimeter standard gauge. So usage would have really been pretty restricted in any case. So which version is true? Well, I couldn't really find any solid evidence either way, but the hidden version's definitely a better story. In any case, the stories converge again in 1971, when it was bought by Dr. George Mahoon in California, originally destined for a passenger railroad being built there. That railroad was never completed, so the locomotive was never actually needed there. After the 1985 fire here at Hesston damaged so much of their equipment, number 1930 came to Hesston to get their steam passenger service back up and running in 1987. After fairly minimal work, which is all that was needed since it never actually been put into use, it began service here in 1987, finally put into service for the first time in its life, 47 years after it was built. And it's still in service here today.
So although there's at least two versions of this locomotive story, they're both really good stories. And in any case, CKD locomotives like this, steam engines in general, of course, are always a part of the Industrial Revolution.
Hey, wait just a second before you go. I need your help to keep the channel growing here. First thing you can do is really easy. Just like, subscribe, share this video. Tell all your friends about it. That spreads the word. YouTube will see that and we'll show this to more people. Commenting more than just 2 or 3 words. YouTube says that's the most important thing you can get. It's the best kind of user interaction there is. So you can comment more than just 2 or 3 words. Also, if you're able to and are interested in helping out financially, these are pretty expensive videos to film, a lot of travel costs on top of the hours of work I do here. You can help out at patreon.com/industrialrevolution. or become a member here on YouTube, or a single contribution through Super Thanks. Also have an affiliate store. If you click that, anything you buy there, a percentage of that purchase will come to help fund the channel. Thanks for your help, and I look forward to seeing you next week.